The Nigerian government has announced a new date for the implementation of the Access to Higher Education Act, otherwise known as the Student Loan Law, recently assented by President Bola Tinubu. Since signing the bill into law in June, many Nigerians have criticized its introduction, describing it as a ground for introduction of tuition fees in the nation's tertiary institutions. Meanwhile, despite the opposition to its implementation, the permanent secretary at the Ministry of Education, Andrew Adejo, revealed at the time that the implementation will commence in September. The implementation has, however, not kicked off as announced by Mr. Adejo. So joining us now is Honorable Terseer Ugbor, Chairman, Ad hoc Committee on Student Loans to Higher Education, member representing Kwande Ushongo Federal Constituency, Benue State. Pleasure to have you here. I mean, let's talk about the things you have to put in place to be able to have this student loan in the first place, the workability. I hazard that you'll have to put a student bank in place and other things like that. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. On the 12th of June 2023, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu signed into law the Student Loans Act. The intention of this act was to provide access to higher education for every student that seeks higher education in Nigeria. However, the House of Representatives, taking cognizance of the public outcry on some of the issues, some of the clauses in this act that kind of hindered and restricted proper access to these student loans, moved the motion on the floor of the House, urging for further legislative action to amend and to restructure certain components of this act to make sure that it covers every student in Nigeria, both the indigent and non-indigent students who seek higher education in Nigeria. And a committee was set up to call a stakeholder summit, a legislative summit of all stakeholders in the education sector to look at this act and see how we can propose amendments to the act that ensure that the act achieves the purpose for which it was set up to do. Don't forget that this act was sponsored in the 9th Assembly by the current Chief of Staff, Right Honorable Femi Gbajabiamila. So there's a passion and an interest in ensuring that student loans work in Nigeria again. Student loans were first introduced in Nigeria in 1972. And many of our parents in those days benefited from student loan schemes and didn't have to pay for education out of pocket. But this scheme did not last long. After a few years, it was closed down. Government changed it into something like more of a scholarship scheme, a bursary scheme. And then, of course, when you turn it to a bursary or a scholarship scheme, then it becomes a kind of a palliative. And this remained the case for over 40 years now. So it's time that Nigeria gets back to the era where students can access financing for their education, regardless of their place in society and regardless of the course of study they want to study. So we've conducted the summit. Stakeholders were all in the room. ASU was there, the Vice Chancellors of Committee were there, the Central Bank was there, the Ministry of Finance, the Nigerian Association of Nigerian Students were there, and several other groups. I think over 30 stakeholders. Yaga Africa was present, and several other technology partners, insurance companies, lecturers and stakeholders in the education sector. And a set of amendments and proposals have been submitted to the National Assembly by this committee. And we're hoping that in the next few weeks, we'll harmonize our reports with the executive arm of government and see how we can represent the Student Loans Act on the floor and get it passed as soon as possible so that the 2024 deadline for commencement of the student loan scheme, as stated by the President a few days ago, is actually met, and the targets for which we hope to achieve are actually accomplished.
All right. In terms of the procedures, modalities for disbursement of this loan, and still talking about structures that have been put in place to ensure that this commencement or the deadline of January 2024 is met. What progress has been made in this regard? What would be the disbursement modalities for the loan? Also, something that NANS had raised was the issue around, in the unfortunate event of the death of a beneficiary, post loan disbursement? What is the repayment plan? Will there be a forgiveness clause? Would the family members or the guarantors be made to pay back this loan? So those questions are still in terms of fine-tuning this act. What's your take on that?
Yeah, we've decided that the act, the scheme should be fully automated. So it should be technology-driven. So we're setting up, we're currently building a platform, a software that makes it very easy and seamless for students to go and register on this platform, upload their schools, where they're coming from, upload their admission letters, and then, of course, the invoice from the school of how much their school fees will cost them for the duration of the entire program that they'll be studying. So this system will automatically assess this information. There are APIs that link up to the universities, so code is generated for you to pay the school fees through this platform. Then you issue the receipts. The school is notified of your payment, the payment of your school fees through the student loans platform. And then you just walk into school, you do your registrations, you get your books, and you can commence your education immediately. The idea is to make this process as seamless as possible for Nigerians, working with the commercial banks across the country, working with a technology partner who will manage this process seamlessly and reduce the need for human interference and contact as much as possible, so that students that genuinely need these loans and students that will be beneficiaries of these student loans by merit can access these loans without having to know or need anybody apart from the basic guarantors of your family, of your parents, or your guardians as guarantors for the loan. We've tried to remove every other requirement that hinders access to these student loans. And then on the second point about, you mentioned...
Repayment. I mentioned repayment in the event of, yes. And just to add to that, because you mentioned something, would there be an upper threshold limit in terms of the amount of money that each student is allowed to access? Because different universities have different fees in some instances. And then would it just be to public institutions?
Well, there are two models that we're considering. We're considering a model that works with the school fees, the exact school fees of the school you're applying to. So you cannot be offered a loan higher than the total amount of school fees from the school that you have applied to. Or we can actually do a flat rate model where government decides that there's a flat rate of, say, 1 million naira per student. And so schools will have to manage they have to structure their school fees in a way that doesn't exceed the threshold that government is offering. And if your school fees exceeds that threshold, then you have to look for alternative means of funding to subsidize, to supplement what the government has offered. From our studies, there are about 2 million university students in the country. The National Open University alone has about 500,000 students schooling there. These are students who are probably working and schooling at the same time. And then about 1.5 million students across our public and private institutions. We don't want to discriminate against any student, either in a public school or private school. We believe that parents who have sent their children to private schools have not done that necessarily because they can all afford to do it. Many of them have done it to avoid the consistent strikes and the consistent challenges of schooling in public education, and of course the drop in the quality of education in some of our public schools. That is why parents have moved their children to private schools. So we want the private schools to also be covered in these student loan schemes. And I can assure you that some of the private universities are actually not more expensive than public schools. Some of the private polytechnics I've seen around in many local governments are actually just like public schools in terms of the amount of fees that they require their students to pay. And so we're trying to remove that discrimination against public and private, because these are all Nigerians, these are all taxpayers, and then one way or the other, if government puts a flat rate on the fees or on what you can assess, then you decide on if that will cover you in a private school or in a public school, and then you make your choice of how you can afford to cover the rest of it. And then you talked about repayment in case of debt. We've proposed that this student loan should be covered by insurance. And then, of course, there should be some flexible repayment processes, and then there should be room for debt forgiveness, for student debt forgiveness in case of, say, maybe our armed forces servicemen, our national heroes, and people who have exemplified themselves in ways that the government considers it necessary to forgive their student loans. But generally, we've proposed that this student loan should be covered by insurance. So in the case of death of a student, the insurance company steps in and takes care of the liability of this particular student. Or even in the case of abscondment, because we believe that a lot of abscondment may take place in this kind of system, we try to reduce the possibility of those kind of loan abscondments or defaults as much as possible. But I think with the structure that we're putting in place now with insurance as part of the framework, I think the insurance companies will play a good role in helping to ensure that these fees are not lost by the government.
Okay, Honorable Ugbor, I guess like everything else, the devil is in the details. Are there lessons that we have learned from the experiment with student loans in the 70s? You quoted 1972. I was under the Gowon administration. But you recall that shortly after, there was so much talk about cost-reflective tuition in Nigerian schools, which led to the Ali Must Go crisis and all of that. Are there lessons we learned from the past? Because the Student Welfare and Loans Board eventually did not work. So have you taken that into consideration? The second thing, in the case of defaulters, there may well be willful defaulters. So is there penalty, for those willful defaulters? Because it's based on employment. When you are employed 2 years after NYSC, there are persons who don't get a job 5-6 years after NYSC. What happens? Would that also be covered by insurance? And third, what do you think of the allegation, the suspicion, that all of this about Higher Education Act and all of that is an attempt to increase students' fees through the back door, particularly as the focus is specifically tuition, not any other item?
Thank you very much, Dr. Abati. Well, first of all, you're talking about the lessons learned from the past. We took a survey of other countries, industrialized countries that have implemented student loan schemes for over 70 years, 60, 70 years. In developed countries, Japan, Canada, many European countries, Australia, who have successfully implemented student loan schemes. And we've seen how the student loans have worked. One of the challenges of the student loan scheme is that it kind of put the students on debt after graduation. And in America, for example, student loans have become a major topic. The country is always trying to forgive student loans. But we've seen examples in Canada, in Europe, in Japan, in China, where student loans have worked and have not left a huge burden on the students in terms of repayment. And we've looked at these models, and we've kind of tried to design our model here to suit the positive examples that we've seen around the world. During the summits some months ago in the National Assembly, we had a senior advocate of Nigeria who went to school in the 70s, and he came to the summit with his student loan receipts. The invoice that he was invoiced at that time, I think it was about 2,000 naira or something like that. And he said he had not repaid his student loans all these years. And he was requesting for an account where he can repay his student loans. So we told him that he should go to the central bank and calculate all the profits on the loans all the years. But it was just a humor in a good moment. The point is that federal governments back in the days transited from student loans to scholarship systems to bursary systems. I think this was as a result of the boom, the oil boom that we experienced in the 70s. So we felt there was no need to give loans, but rather we decided to implement this free tuition system, bursary system, scholarship system. So we made it a scholarship scheme. And this is part of the kind of subsidies that we introduced for education that has lasted for many, many years without any reforms or any changes to this model. Despite the tremendous growth in our population, the tremendous increase in university education attendance in Nigeria, and the number of universities that have expanded have come up in Nigeria over the past 50 years or so. So when the sector is growing, but the system of education, of funding education, did not grow and did not change. And that was why this scheme crashed and was never reintroduced since then. But now our economy is changing. The tolerance for subsidies in every aspect of our national life is not that high anymore. And we cannot continue to afford to subsidize education at the level we've subsidized it. If you look at the cost of education in Nigeria, it's far, far, far lower than even the average African country, not to talk of the countries around the world. Nigeria students pay some of the lowest fees. Now, we understand that the economy is poor and Nigeria has not developed its citizens to afford education properly enough, and our incomes are stretched on many other expenses, and living costs due to inflation and so many things. But we have to develop more sustainable ways to fund higher education. Secondly, you talked about the debt forgiveness by people who willingly or willfully abscond from the program. We've created a system that plugs into the BVN and the NIM identity. And so, if you willfully abscond from paying your student loans after you have taken a loan, for example, if you got a loan of 1 million naira to support your education, and then you're supposed to pay back in 10 years, if you calculate the interest on these loans and every other fees attached, it will take you'll be required to pay something like 15,000 naira every month. So in a year, you may be paying 150,000 naira annually. In 10 years, you are done paying your loan. We don't consider 15,000 naira monthly too much for a graduate to pay. We understand the unemployment issues in the country, but we structured this such that if you can afford to pay in something for your student loans that you were given, you were offered to go to school, at least every once in a while, so that the government sees the seriousness and the interest in paying, then government can always create avenue and rooms for you to have some leeway in restructuring your repayments. But for sure, you must repay it. If you abscond from repaying your loan for 20, 30 years, now you are in your 50s and you might want to contest an election or you want to go into higher office. Your credit bureau will always show that you are owing the government, and this will become part of the criteria that may disqualify you from maybe aspiring for higher positions in your life. And then at that time, you will start running pillar to post, trying to clear your student loan that you should have cleared 20 years ago. And so some of these mechanisms are put in place to provide incentive for people to ensure that you pay your student loans. If you can't afford to pay because you couldn't get a job after school, or you've had difficulty, or you had challenges, you became handicapped in whatever way possible, then you can approach the Student Loans Board and make a demand, a request for readjustment or restructuring of your student loans. And it can be done. It can be reduced from 15,000 to 5,000 naira monthly. Just any way it is that we can make it easy for Nigerian students to repay these loans and not to abscond from paying. I think we're also trying to plug into an international database, to the credit bureau database internationally. So even if you leave the country, these student loans still reflect on your credit line wherever you go.
Quickly, obviously, you can't use it for international students, or can you use it for international students? That's one. Number two, I'm really concerned about how the student bank will be set up. Because we've had too many intervention banks like this in Nigeria. We see how how is it going to be regulated? Where's the money going to come from? Quickly.
Yeah, well, the student loans is only meant for Nigerian universities. It's not meant to cover foreign universities for now. Just public and private schools, higher education in Nigeria. Secondly, the Nigerian Education Bank was set up in the early 90s. During the Obasanjo years in 2004, it was reformed and reintroduced as a Nigerian education bank. But this bank never took off properly. It was never fully functional and never achieved the purpose for which it was meant to achieve. The current Student Loans Act repeals the Student Loans Bank and proposes a Students Loans Board or a Higher Education Loans Board to replace the Student Loans Bank. The Loans Board will be chaired by a chairman, executive secretary, and board members who will be nominated by the president and other, government functionaries across. The central bank will also be a member of the board. The Federal Inland Revenue will be a member of the board, to ensure that the board is well funded. The total budget and necessity, the need for student loans is always captured in the budget of Nigeria. The Act proposes 1% of all revenue in the country should be dedicated for the student loans. Our committee, during our stakeholder engagement, we propose that the fund should be increased to 3% of all federal government revenue. The United Nations proposes about 16 to 18% of our national budget should be dedicated for education. Nigeria is hovering around 6%, sometimes 3%. Ghana is doing 17% of their budget on education. South Africa is doing 22% of their budget on education. We spend in the lower numbers of our budget. So we think that if the government is really committed to a lasting solution for student funding, student education funding, and don't forget that the student loans is an indirect way of also funding the universities, because it means that there's little dropout scenarios in the country, because every student will be able to afford to pay for the education. And this money is paid directly to the schools. It is not paid to the students. So once the school admits students, if you admit 2,000 students this year, and half of them apply for student loans to cover their education, the government provides these student loans to them, and the school gets this funding to take care of the logistics of running the school fees, lecturers, and other things that have always bedeviled. So we're hoping that this student loan scheme is also another way of funding tertiary education in Nigeria and ensuring that the incidence of strikes, as we've seen over the past decades in the country, is a thing of the past, because students can now pay their education and government can then provide the necessary support to keep the schools running efficiently.
Well, we would like to thank you very much for joining us on The Morning Show. Thank you very much indeed.